Welcome to Romans, God's Solution to Our Problem, a devotional series by Sumo Youth. Make sure you've got a pen and your copy of Romans with you, and if you haven't already, pause the video and pray that Jesus speaks to you through his word today.
Hey guys, welcome to day number 35 of our devotional series by Sumo Youth on the book of Romans, Paul's letter to the Christians in Rome. Day 35, and the passage we're reading today is one where Paul starts talking about the way God's people's behaviour affects God's own reputation. Right. Now that's not what the whole section's about, and if you haven't already done this, maybe go back and do our day 5 devotion, which is actually on the same passage. But today that's the part of these verses which we're going to be focusing on, thinking how does our behaviour as God's people, and historically the behaviour of, say, the Jewish nation when they were exclusively his people, how does our behaviour affect his name and his reputation? So have a read of the passage. And here's the questions, which we're going to pause the video and have a think about halfway through. The first one is just exactly that. How does God's people's hypocrisy and rule breaking affect his reputation? Secondly, bringing it a bit closer to home, how will the way you live today affect God's reputation? Not just generally, but you and today. How will that affect the way the people around you see God? And thirdly, how can you show that you're one of God's people, not only on the outside, but in your heart as well? The very end of our passage talks about that idea, that being one of God's people is more than just an outward sign and our actions, but it happens in our heart. Spend some time in the passage thinking, how is that going to be true for you? Pause the video, press play again, and we'll have a chat about what you found in the passage. So hopefully some of those words from Paul were helped us to reflect a little bit, and maybe were a little bit humbling for us as God's people. I know for me that it's a passage that rebukes me a bit and encourages me to be more faithful as one of God's people. Let's see what it is particularly that Paul was talking about. The first question, how does his people's hypocrisy and rule breaking affect God's reputation? Well, Paul observes that whenever we see God's people, so often what it looks like is that we teach the law and we talk about what God wants us to be like, and we tell other people to do that, but then we ourselves don't actually practice what we preach. We end up being hypocrites. Right? And that when we do that, that doesn't just bring dishonor to us, it actually brings dishonor to God. In our passage, the words Paul used, he said, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. What he's saying is there's nations out there and they can't see God because he's invisible, but what they can see is God's people. And when they look at God's people, do they see people who make them say, God is wonderful, God is amazing, God's rules are good, God is loving, God is wise, we should follow him? Or when they look at God's people, God's representatives, are they actually given reason to mock God and to think God doesn't know what he's talking about? God's people are hypocrites. They tell us what to do, but they're just judging us. They don't even do it themselves. That was a problem in Paul's day. I think we need to reflect on whether that's a problem for us as well. Do people who know you and know you're a Christian think well of God because of you? Or do they maybe think poorly of God because of the way you live as one of his people? Hard question, isn't it? But an important question for us to reflect on if we want to be following him and representing him to the rest of the world. Second question, how will the way you live today affect his reputation? Hopefully you can actually think of some ways that at school today, or in your family today, or with your friends or in sporting teams maybe, that you can behave in a way that when people see that and they know you're a Christian, that actually reflects well on God. Pause and think about some of the ways that might happen for you today or tomorrow or this week, but make them real things that can happen within the next few days. And then that last question, how can you show that you are one of God's people? By your heart, not just what's on the outside. Again, that's a question maybe you just need to sit and think about, look at what you've written in your book and spend some time praying about that. Because it's easy for us to start looking like one of God's people and know all of the rules in our mind. And so be able to put on a mask that makes us look like we're a good follower of Jesus. But then on the inside, to not really be that person, to have a heart that doesn't want to obey God. It just wants to please the people around us when they see us. We need to look at ourselves and inspect ourselves and be honest if that's us. Because what we read here is that being one of God's people just by outward appearance doesn't impress anyone, and it definitely doesn't impress God. What God wants are people whose hearts are pointed towards Him, not just who are playing a good part in a play. Spend some time thinking about these things honestly with yourself. Do some business with God. Pray, talk to Him, and we'll see you again for the next video.